Okay, time has come. Couple of announcements before I start pressuring people to come up with a joke. One is, remember that the second midterm is this weekend. Don't forget it. It's going to be available to you as of 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, and you have to complete it before midnight Sunday night. Once you start it, you've got 90 minutes to answer 100 multiple choice questions, very much the same format as midterm 1. And yes, it will cover all of chapter 11, and I think that I will manage to get through those parts of 11 that are on the test. That's my goal today, anyway. Questions about that? Yeah, good. On your D2L, it says that the midterm is available. Is that what everyone else's has too? Has anyone else looked? It should be visible to you. Yeah. What's dated 2023? Oh, well, that's the problem. Okay. Thank you. You just averted a horrible disaster for me. All right, I'll fix that. Well, maybe that was a Friday in 2023. Yeah. Great question. Oh, and there are two sets of videos you want to watch beforehand. One is the 60 minutes segment on sexual orientation. You can see back when I was all Hollywood, and it's 5 segments, but it's like 20 minutes total. And then there's a documentary that was on Nova about a case I'll only have time to mention today, but all the salient points are in that video, and I think it's a 50-minute video. Okay. Questions about that? Oh, now, who's got a joke? I've been going that way. All right, I'll go this way. Are you going to stand up to tell the joke? Who's got a joke? Come on, I saw that look. You've got one in reserve, don't you? Yeah. Oh, come on. But you all have, the different. Yeah. Who does? Volunteer. Come on, be brave. If I said it was extra credit, you'd have your hand up, right? Excellent. Thank you. Hold on. So here you go.
I'm Abby.
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully no one said this one, but
Nice and loud.
What did Cinderella say to Prince Charming?
What did Cinderella say to Prince Charming?
Want to see if it fits?
Want to see if it fits. Yes. Yep. Well, that totally makes sense. See, you can have a double entendre about anything, right? That old joke that no matter what someone else says, you say afterwards, that's what she said. It turns out there's nothing the person can say that doesn't make that reply absurd, etc. So we've been talking about sex differences, and there's a framework that I want you to have firmly in your mind as we talk about sex differences, because there are lots of different sex differences in behavior and structure, etc. And you might not have in your mind, how can you tell which sex difference is bigger or how big a sex difference is, etc. And statistics worked this out a long time ago. You ask yourself, how different are the two means, the means of population 1 versus population 2? How much of a difference is there between them? And it doesn't matter what it is you're measuring, whether it's in inches or feet or seconds, you can express how big that difference is by looking at the standard deviation of the two populations and ask how many standard deviations apart are those two populations. And it's a small, and we call this D prime. In the case of a small D prime, like 0.2, you can see that there's loads of overlap. And I would say most scientists are very reluctant to study any phenomena that has a difference that small, because it just becomes difficult to do the research to find differences. And in psychology, at least, an effect size of 0.5, half a standard deviation, is considered medium, and as an effect size of 0.8 is considered a large behavioral difference in psychology. And indeed, there are very few sex differences in behavior that are that big as a D prime of 0.8. And notice that even with a supposedly big psychological effect, the overlap is sizable, so that there's this big area where either the red population or the blue population could arise. An example I like to talk about is shown here, an effect size of 2 standard deviations. In terms of a behavioral sex difference, that's huge. As we're going to see in a moment, there are no sex differences that are that big. Well, but everyone has a sense for how the sex difference in human height, right? In general, men tend to be taller than women. And you all know that there's plenty of exceptions to that. And I'll remind you again, this is a huge difference in behavioral terms. And just as an exercise, I can tell you that the standard deviation difference is about 2 standard deviations. And so if you wanted to divide people and accurately say that's a man, that's a woman based on height alone, I can even tell you where to put the cutoff. Oh, and I have a slide for this. I'm sorry, this is not in your PDF. So, hold on. And that's about 65.5 inches. So 5 feet, pardon me, I got that wrong, 66.5, 5 feet, 6.5 inches. To get the maximum accuracy, you say everyone who's that height or above is a man, and everyone who's that height and below is a woman. In that categorical system, by the way, I'd be classified as a woman. But more importantly, you do the math, and it turns out you'd be wrong more than 15% of the time. About 17% of the time, you would be wrong if you classified their sex based on their height. And I tell you this to say, as we talk about these different statistical differences, it's really important to keep in mind the difference that just because there's a statistical difference between groups, that doesn't mean that there's much predictive power of that factor. And I say this despite the fact that even small statistical differences between groups, while they don't offer any predictive power about individuals, they may be very important theoretically in terms of trying to understand mechanisms. Okay? And you'll see that in a bit. So you've heard about sex differences in human behavior. The ones that people talk about is the sex difference in verbal ability. Which sex tends to have better verbal ability? Women. And math ability. Which sex tends to have better math ability on average? Yeah. And those effect sizes are D primes of 0.5 or less. They're tiny. If you want to find the big sex differences in human behavior, you want to look at sexual behaviors. So interest in casual sex, that's a large difference, T prime of 0.8. And I don't need you to memorize any of these, but I want you to have some sense of where they fall. Oh, do I need to ask which sex is more interested in casual sex? Okay, say it out each time. Interest in visual pornography, that's a big one. The biggest one I have up here. Which sex is more interested in visual pornography? Loud, okay. Attraction to older partner. Which sex is more attracted to older partners? Women, yep. Concern about partner's attractiveness? Men, yep. Shallow as can be. Concerned about partner's wealth or status? Women, yep. And frequency of masturbation? Men, right? And this is going to be of interest later, as a framework. And we'll talk about sexual attraction in a later chapter. And I'll ask you, how many think that men's interest in attractiveness indicates a shallow attitude about romance? My guess is all of you. Thank you. 2 hands back there. And how many of you think that a woman's interest in her partner's status and wealth, how many of you find that shallow? Okay. And I'll ask you, what's the difference in terms of the value or the moral stance there? Why is there something wrong with women being concerned about their partner's status or wealth? Okay, we'll talk about that later. The sex difference in masturbation, I hope it's getting smaller, but you don't know. We'll talk about that too. So, if we ask people what sex are you attracted to, the vast majority of people are exclusively attracted to the opposite sex. And there are some people that are somewhat bisexual and they're mostly attracted to the opposite sex. There are a few people that say that they're equally attracted to men and women, and notice that that's much more common among women than it is among men. Women are more flexible in who they fall in love with and who they become sexually aroused by. But in terms of those that are mostly attracted to the same sex or only exclusively attracted to the same sex, notice that the total's less than 5%, right? In both cases, less than 2%. And that has been remarkably stable as long as people have been doing surveys, starting with in the era after the Kinsey studies. What's interesting is that's changing. With different cohorts, it's much easier now to find people who say they are attracted to the opposite sex. Most of that increase, notice, is among people who say they're bisexual. In terms of people who say they're attracted exclusively to the same sex, that hasn't risen nearly as much. And you can think about, and later maybe we'll talk about, what sort of trends in society might be going on to result in that. And we'll come back to this. We talked about this briefly when we talked about gender dysphoria. But in the classic study of boys who their families brought them to psychiatrists because they were too feminine, and the book that eventually got published, because this was the name that was most often applied to these boys, was Sissy Boys. Of those feminine boys, the vast majority of them grew up to be attracted to the same sex. And here, these boys were studied in the 1980s and 1990s, and you really have to wonder, the 10 boys that said they were heterosexual in adulthood, you have to wonder how many of them were hiding their true sexual orientation in a society that's even more homophobic than ours today. You go back to the previous crowd. Right. That doesn't mean that necessarily, but I can tell you that is the case. So in fact, people reporting bisexuality has increased in both sexes, but the greater preponderance of being in women, that's still there. And this is something else that's changing, right? These sorts of statistics. First of all, in 20 years later, the proportion of feminine boys, or if you like, boys who were reporting gender dysphoria who grew up to be gay, just got bigger. And a new trend is that now more and more of those boys will eventually grow up to be trans. And we talked about that some last time, but I'm just touching on this to let you know that's a change that's happening, which indicates, that social influences matter in terms of how people identify. In terms of who you're attracted, questions about that? And the other big sex difference, the biggest sex difference, again, not sex differences, not in verbal ability or math. The big sex differences are in occupational interests. One of the things that people have been talking about for years is the fact that very few women enter the engineering fields. And at first it was because, well, they're not as good at math. But that sex difference has virtually disappeared in terms of math performance on tests, et cetera. And yet still very few women enter engineering. And the real reason that few women enter engineering is they're not interested in it. They have the math skills. They have more than math skills than many of the boys who enter engineering, but that's not what they want to do with their lives. And here we're looking at occupations in which females tend to be most common. And you can see psychologists, sociologists. These are all careers where you tend to work with people. And others would include flight attendants, hairdressers, nurses, etc. In all those jobs, what they have in common is these people are interested in a job where they get to work with people. And you can contrast that to male majority occupations where they tend to be interested in things. So, right, mechanics, etc., various engineering things. Those are more interest to guys. And the point of this chart is that among lesbians, you'll find these occupations are very heavily occupied by men, but you'll find more lesbians in those sorts of occupations than you will find in female-oriented occupations. And likewise, the highest proportion of gay men will be in, actors who work with people, etc. Questions about that? And I'm going to give short shrift to this idea about are there bisexual men, just to say that number one, there's certainly more people reporting that they are bisexual, more men reporting bisexuality than ever before. And for a while, there was some controversy about, well, are they really bisexual or they're gay, but they're trying to avoid the stigma of being gay by saying they're sometimes attracted to women. And that may have been a factor at one point. If you want to have a total mind warp, go back and listen to interviews of, say, Elton John back in the 80s, where there's a radio podcast on BBC. You can listen to it. Something called Island Discs and Desert Island Discs. And in the interview, he talks repeatedly about his marriage with the woman and about his interest in the football club, by which he means soccer club. Nowhere in that interview would you have any idea that he's at all gay. And he has said that there were times when he said he was bisexual, but it was never the case. And so that'll be a factor that we'll be talking about eventually. But I would say no one any longer disputes that there are bisexual men. Okay. So now that we've talked about and have some metric for looking at the size of sex difference, here is a theory about why some people are attracted to the opposite sex and some to the same sex. And we can talk about it as being a question of whether prenatal androgen exposure, it makes a difference in terms of whether people will grow up to be attracted to men or women. And the idea is if androgen levels are high before birth, those individuals will be males and will grow up to be attracted to women, gynophilic. And if androgen levels are low, then they'll be attracted to men. And so the idea, maybe some people become lesbians because they've been exposed to higher levels of androgen before birth, and maybe some men become gay because they saw less androgen before birth. Pretty simple-minded idea. And of course, it's totally grounded in the animal research where as I told you, for all those sex differences in behavior or in neural structure, brain structure, You can make the animal as masculine or feminine as you like just by controlling prenatal androgen. So I have to tell you, for most of my life and most of my career, this struck me as one of the dumbest ideas I'd ever heard of. Because all my degrees are in psychology, I know how sensitive we are to social influences, et cetera. I know how rabid the gender police are as soon as a baby comes out of the womb, right? And it seemed to me you don't need to refer to prenatal hormones to explain why 95% of people are attracted to the opposite sex, right? That believe me, all those Disney movies are inculcating this attitude right away. And then I remember it so well. In the late 90s, I read a report and I couldn't believe it. I mean, I found it hard to believe. And it involved a measure you've probably never heard of called otoacoustic emissions. Oto as in the ear, acoustic, sounds. So it turns out right now, your ears are making sounds while I'm talking to you. If I put you in a quiet room and stick a microphone deep in your ear, I will record all these clicks and things that are happening, and occasional ringing that are happening inside your ear. And let's stop for a moment and listen. Anyone hear those? Good. You grew up with them, and therefore your brain long ago learned to cancel those out. You're not allowed to have any conscious awareness of them, but they are happening. And it turns out that females have more of these otoacoustic emissions than males. That's a sex difference that's present at birth. And in general, the more otoacoustic emissions you make, the better your hearing. So, bless you. This is one of the reasons why women, on average, have better hearing than men. And my joke here is I have no explanation for why women listen better than men, but I do know why they hear better than men. And it turned out there was this report. So here, there's a microphone in there, and there's a click that happened. There was a report about the sex difference, and actually I knew about the sex difference in otoacoustic emissions because I had a colleague down the hall who was an auditory psychophysiologist. And I knew what they were for. But what this report was that yes, straight women have more of these emissions than straight men, but that gay women, lesbians, have fewer emissions than straight women. And this really, made me rethink things because I'm pretty sure that this sex difference that's present at birth, if it's there before there's any social influence, it almost certainly is due to the sex difference in prenatal androgen, right? Because all the other sex differences in the body are caused by that. And so why would gay women have fewer of these otoacoustic emissions unless maybe they got a little less androgen before birth than the straight women? And, well, look for that later. So that's in 1998. I remember that in 1999, I'm sitting in my office at Berkeley. I'd been in the psych department about 20 years already by then. And I'm reading this paper. And keep in mind, my entire adult life, I've spent studying sex differences, mostly in animals, right? But I'm very well informed about the human literature. And I read this paper that says there's a sex difference in the pattern of length of fingers that's present in 2-year-old children. Unlike the otoacoustic emissions, if it's present in 2-year-olds, it's almost certainly due to the sex difference in prenatal androgen. And it's like there'd been this idea that prenatal androgens might have something to do with sexual orientation. I was in the Bay Area. We have loads of gay people and lesbians. So, okay, as kind of a lark, we started asking about this. When I looked into it, I'm glossing over this some. The first person to talk about this in a scientific way was a German anthropologist, and it's a great paper. If you remind me, I'll publish it. Put an English translation on D2L for you. It's a great paper if you want to just browse at it sometime, not for the test, where he says, there's something you ask people and everybody knows the answer. How many legs do spiders have? Everybody seems to know that. But then you ask people, well, how many legs do crabs have? And people give you different answers, because they're not so sure about it. And he says, if you ask people which finger's longer, the index finger, the ring finger, he says, every time I ask someone that, the first thing to do is look at their hand and then say whatever they see on their hand. And I've noticed that women are more likely to say they're the same length than men are. And it turns out that's true. And here's this 1998 paper that I was reading in 1999. So here's the nature of the difference. So we can put a hand down on a Xerox machine, put a ruler there, and we measure how long the second digit is, 78 millimeters, and how long the fourth digit is. So that's 2D, 4D. And that ratio, in this case, is less than 1. And that's a pretty typical male hand. It's mine, actually. And here's another pattern you see sometimes where the second digit is longer a little bit than the fourth digit. So there, the 2D, 4D is over 1. Now, I see some of you looking at your hands right now, and you're noticing whether your index finger is shorter than your ring finger. And I just want to urge you, do not panic. It's going to be okay. I'll walk you through this. So, this difference is at most a medium difference in sex difference. The D prime is about 0.5. That means there's loads of overlap. So that's one reason why you don't need to panic. And Cohen, who came up with this D prime as a measure of how big differences are, he has, in his book, he has a great example of it that everyone knows, which is it's about the difference in height between 14-year-old girls and 18-year-old girls. So that means that if I put a group of 20 girls and told you 10 or 14 and 10 or 18, and they were chosen at random, if you tried to sort them by height, you'd be wrong a lot. You'd have a lot more than 17% error because the D prime is only 0.5 as opposed to the D prime in human height of being 0.2. Everyone get that? But I'll point out something about statistics. On the other hand, if I segregate the two apart, one's only 14-year-olds and one's only 18-year-olds, and I told you the mean height of the two groups, you'd know instantly which are the 14-year-olds and which are the 18-year-olds, because those means will always be very different, especially if it's a group as big as 10. All right. So it's a statistical difference that is of theoretical importance. People get taller as they get older, but it offers no predictive power. Okay. So at the time, I'm going to go through this quickly because I want to cover the material, but you already know everything you need to know to gauge whether this has something to do with prenatal testosterone. And here are the 4 things we've talked about that can cause a sex difference in the body, right? Some things are caused by genetic sex, the gonads, whether they develop as testes or ovaries. Some are determined by anti-Mullerian hormone. That's what suppresses the Mullerian ducts. Some things are masculinized by androgen hormones, like the Wolffian ducts, external genitalia, and some sex differences occur because society causes them to happen. Well, it turns out that this sex difference is present before birth, so it can't be socially mediated. And it is masculinized, that is, the ratio gets smaller in people who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is consistent with it being due to androgen. But most importantly, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. So here's a look at a relatively small sample of women that have CAH here. they have a smaller, more masculine digit ratio than control women. And notice that we only saw this difference in the right hand. We never saw it in the left. Okay, so for whatever reason, the right hand seems to be more sensitive to this prenatal factor than the left. But the real reason I know this is reflecting prenatal testosterone is because in women with androgen insensitivity syndrome, the 2D4D ratio is feminine. So here's a look first at otoacoustic emissions, and it's control men, control women, and women with congenital adrenal insensitivity syndrome, which means they have a Y chromosome. They had male levels of anti-Müllerian hormone, but their outside looks feminine, and the digit ratios are also feminine. So especially on the right hand, the women who have androgen sensitivity syndrome, if anything, notice they're super feminine. They have an average 2D4D that's even greater than control women. So in the life sciences, that's the gold standard, that a difference between groups is due to a gene, is when you knock out the gene and the difference between the two groups goes away. Knock out the androgen receptor gene, and these women with AIS and men are the same. And I'm going to skip over other than that. Lots of evidences. So, and I'm going to, so it looks like, here's a fantasy, is it turns out that if I lift up a flap of skin on your forehead, there's a little set of numbers in there displayed that tells me how much androgen you got exposed to before birth, right? That'd be really handy to do, because then I'd say, oh, you had this much androgen before birth, you had that much androgen before birth, right? And to some extent, the digit ratios are like that. They give me a clue to how much prenatal androgen you were exposed to. It's really imperfect, right? Since the sex difference is only 0.5, you know that this measure of prenatal androgen has got to be pretty weak. So if that's the case, then we can ask ourselves, well, do differences in prenatal androgen have any influence on human sexual orientation? And I'm going to skip over what's good about that. And I just want to be explicit. So, two hypotheses about human sexual orientation. So, one is social experience. We teach children who they should be attracted to, and when they get to be about 10 years old or so, they are attracted to the opposite sex. And they're not consciously aware of the fact that they're doing this because of what we taught them, but that's how it works. That's what happens. Or the other idea is that prenatal androgens that masculinize the body also masculinize the brain and make them more likely to be attracted to the opposite sex if they have high levels of androgen. And in this regard, I want to point out to you that you people who are straight, you may be very nice people, but in terms of distinguishing between these two hypotheses, you're worthless to me. Because you're consonant with both. On the other hand, people who are gay, people who have a homosexual orientation, they refute both of these hypotheses. They're informative despite that fact. And so I'm telling you this to say that when we started asking about people, finding gay people and looking at the digit ratios, it wasn't because we thought they needed explaining away, right? It was because they were the only ones who offered a test of this hypothesis. And so we went out to the Bay Area. I'm going to skip all that. And went to street fairs. It was the most fun and the cheapest experiment I've ever done in my life. We went to street fairs and we asked people anonymously to tell us all sorts of personal things about themselves. When were you born? How many brothers did you have? Who are you attracted to? Who do you have sex with? Who would you like to have sex with? Etc. And they never had to put their names down. But then we also asked them which arm do you use to throw a ball and which arm do you use to write with? And those last two questions was really just a lure. We didn't really expect to see anything interesting there. We only asked them that because the next thing we said is, can we please Xerox your hands? And, it was a 2-day street fair, and we how do we offer them an incentive? Why would people do all this? Why would they answer these questions? Well, it turns out we offered them a $1 lottery scratcher ticket. People will tell you anything for a $1 lottery scratcher ticket, which is pretty funny because you do the math and they're only worth about 13 cents, right? Because most of them are worthless. But okay, so I go to the 7-Eleven store that morning, and I'm going in with a bunch of cash, and I'm asking the clerk to please, could I have 720 lottery scratcher tickets, $1 lottery, and please, can I have a receipt because I got to get reimbursed for the money for the research project, not from federal funds, by the way. I would never have tried to do that with federal funds. Anyway, and I thought we were going to be there 2 days. We ran out of lottery tickets first day. All right, it was just, it was, okay. Well, I guess we're not coming back tomorrow because and for the most part, I thought there's no way this is going to work. Right, this is too dopey. Anyway, so we confirmed for the right hand, but not for the left. We confirmed that straight women have larger 2D/4D ratios than straight men. And we found that lesbians, on average, had a smaller digit ratio than straight women. And, it really made me stop to think. First of all, I also want to point out that straight men and gay men, we saw no difference in their digit ratios, about which more later. But it's like, so we published this in 2000, and I don't know how to explain that. I don't know how to explain there being this difference in average digit ratio in lesbians versus straight women, except that lesbians on average were exposed to more prenatal testosterone than the straight women. And I don't know how to explain that, except to say that the amount of prenatal testosterone you're exposed to before birth has an influence on whether you'll be gynophilic when you grow up, which is totally strange, right? This is happening in the first trimester of pregnancy, and the sexual orientation won't unfold until more than a decade later. Yeah, Sophie? I bet not. Well, it was stupid of us to ask this one, but we did. Yeah. Hold on. Great question. Not stupid at all. I will get there. Okay. So, I really had to kind of rethink things in terms of my own thinking about this topic. And we published it in a high-profile journal, Nature, and it was pretty scary, right? Because what if we're wrong, right? Then we made this big noise and nobody can replicate it. Oh, I'll go there in a moment. Happily, the very next year, there was a replication published. And for a while, every calendar year, there was a new group saying that, lesbians on average have a smaller digit ratio than straight women. One of my favorites was this 2003 study that had the smallest sample size. It was just 7 monozygotic twins, women. And it turns out that statistically, the lesbian twin had a more masculine digit ratio than the lesbian that was than the twin that was attracted to men. And that tells you, number one, genes aren't everything. We already knew that monozygotic twins aren't always concordant for sexual orientation. But it also tells you that how much testosterone you're exposed to before birth doesn't necessarily reflect only your genes. Right? Abner? How is it possible for monozygotic twins to get exposed to different levels of androgen? The short answer is, of course, I don't know, but they're not totally identical in every way, right? I mean, if you look hard enough, you can find differences between monozygotic twins, right? Because things aren't the same in this amniotic sac versus that amniotic sac, or condition, variance happens. That's just the nature of life. And anyway, so it's there. The next year we replicated it. We went back to another street fair, this one a gay street fair in Oakland. Oakland is full of lesbians, by the way. It's a very vibrant community. And so we asked the same questions, it's the same incentive, and we asked them one more question: do you consider yourself to be butch or femme? And it turns out that it was only the butch lesbians that had a more masculine digit ratio. And so that suggests that the femme lesbians, that they're being attracted to women might have nothing to do with their prenatal androgen levels, right? They got there another way. And we know that's so, right? Plenty of women who were straight at one point in their life, their marriage ends and they fall in love with a woman, and now they consider themselves to be lesbian. And so, yeah. And I'll come back to it. No. And we saw no difference between gay and straight men. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. I just want to say that never in my life have I heard from more strangers than when we published this paper. And everyone who identified themselves as gay was very positive. But I had lots of strangers who would leave messages. There was a time when you still got letters. I've got a great file of letters. People, strangers wrote me, etc., saying things like, I know you're lying. I know you're gay and you're making this up in order to justify what was then called the gay agenda, to justify people who choose a gay lifestyle. And I had reporters ask me my sexual orientation. It was like, well, what's my sexual orientation got to do with the data? And they'd say, well, if you're gay, maybe you're biased to think that it's, that maybe you're biased to see it and it's not really there. And I refused to answer because I said, you know what? If I tell you I'm straight, if I tell you I'm gay, then you're going to say, oh, I'm making this up. And if I tell you I'm straight, you're going to think I'm trying to distance myself from gay people, right? And so what I would tell you is on the research team, we had a nice mixture of sexual orientations, which was true. So, and there were two different feminists, lesbians, self-identified lesbians, who were furious with me that I even asked the question. In this piece on Salon, this woman says twice, she says there was mean-spirited science to ask whether lesbians and gay and straight women might have any differences between them. By the way, that's not me, but it's not, they didn't make a bad guess what it looked like except for the tie and lab coat. And from the beginning, I tried to get people to understand the limitations of this, and with limited success, but I'm going to try it with you. Okay? If you like, I will teach you how to get a random sample of people, look at the right hand, and guess their sexual orientation, and you're going to be right 95% of the time. You want me to teach you how to do that? Get your random sample of people, look at the right hand, because it's the one that's more sensitive. Pay very careful attention to whether the index finger is longer or the ring finger is longer. And no matter what you see, guess straight. And you'll be right 95% of the time if it was a random sample of people, right? So you cannot use this to detect whether someone's a secret lesbian. I'm sorry. I don't know why you want to do that. So it doesn't tell you anything about an individual. Just like, right, we talked about earlier, when there's that small a sex difference, you can't classify people by that. So it's not good for that, and it's not a show. I'll skip the Bible lesson, the Bible school lesson. It's not a shibboleth. If you want, you can look at this, and if you don't know, it's a nice $30 English word, shibboleth. So you can read about it there. In the meantime, but questions about that so far? We did eventually go back to studying men, and it turns out there's probably, just as there's more than one pathway to becoming a lesbian, there's more than one pathway to becoming a gay man. And what we looked at was we compared right-hand digit ratios of gay men versus straight men, and the groups combined like that, we saw no difference, just as before. But if we asked the gay men one more question, do you prefer to be a top or a bottom? Which is to say, do you prefer the role in sex when you're the one inserting into someone's anus? Or do you prefer the role where someone's inserting something into your anus? Or do you like both? So looking at their preferred anal sex role. And lo and behold, tops had more masculine digit ratios than bottoms. And when we did the study before, we were lumping all these people together. And so they ended up looking in between, and therefore not different from straight men. Again, and this difference is even smaller than the sex difference. So no, you don't be looking at your digit ratio and try to guess which way you prefer sex. And we also asked people to recall how gender conforming they were as children, and we saw that there was a statistical relationship there. The more people reported they were gender nonconforming growing up, the larger the digit ratio tended to be. In other words, the men who were more masculine boys had more masculine digit ratios. But oh yeah, yeah. So no. Oh yeah. So there is, yeah. That's Christopher. So, but I probably didn't include this in this original study. Two of my children are co-authors too. So, how to explain this? Nick was 15 and Tessa was 10. And I would not let the graduate students be involved at first because there's no way this is going to work and it'd be a waste of their time. So there were a couple of undergraduates who, okay, let's go try to do this. But I needed more people to work the booth. So Tessa would array the various lottery tickets on a table so that once people let us Xerox their hands, she would help them pick out which lottery ticket they wanted, which one they preferred, right? They're all the same. Anyway, and this was at a phase when she always insisted on wearing dresses. And so, which she eventually got out of. I don't know where she got it because her mom never did. But, and Nick was the one who would take the Xerox hands and note which questionnaire they went with and carefully file them. And he was great at it. And when I asked them to do that, I said, well, so I can pay you. But if I pay you, then, if there's ever a publication, I won't feel like you should be an author because you were paid for your work. But if everything ever comes out of it, then you'll be a co-author. And they both opted for that. And I thought I was being so clever, right? Because there's no way this is ever going to get published. But then it did. And so, my daughter went to a small liberal arts college and, majored in biology. And she pointed out to me that her work has been cited in the literature more than all of her faculty combined. So she tells me that she's found there's someone younger that's had that many citations, but I don't know if it's true. So that's where they came from. This happened later, and there was a third kid that was that was involved. Yeah. So it was definitely a family affair. By the way, if you haven't been to gay fairs, I mean, they're remarkably wholesome. I was never worried about taking my kid to these fairs, right? Okay. In the meantime, I'm sorry, I'm being disjointed about this. So what this says to me is that the difference between gay and straight men in terms of who they're attracted to is not a response to how much androgen they got before birth, which, if you think about it, had to be the case because every man, gay or straight, got exposed to enough prenatal androgen that his genitalia looked masculine, right? And if you look at certain measures, in fact, on average, gay men have larger genitalia than straight men. How would that be a result of, not getting enough prenatal testosterone? So what we conclude from this is that who you're attracted to, men or women, is not influenced. That a certain amount of testosterone, once you have enough testosterone to be a man, it's not going to explain any of the variance in whether you're gynophilic or androphilic. But how much testosterone you got early in development might have an influence on your gender conformity as a child. And of course, those tend to correlate. Then finally, another syndrome that we've always touched on briefly is talked about here, where there's some individuals who fail to produce GnRH. And in these individuals, when they're XY individuals, males, so here we're looking at chorionic gonadotropins. I told you before that early in development, the source of gonadotropins that are driving testes to make testosterone is the placenta. So the human chorionic gonadotropin is fine in these individuals, and therefore their early prenatal testosterone secretions are normal. But in control individuals, about the 12th week of gestation, they normally start making their own GnRH, and they now start driving testicular secretion of hormone, so that control males look like this in terms of how much androgen they get before birth, and then there's a peak in the few months after birth. Whereas these individuals, since they have no GnRH of their own, they are exposed to less androgen just before birth, long after sexual differentiation of the genitalia is done. And they don't see this early neonatal pulse of androgen. And when we study these men with idiopathic gonadal dysgenesis, when we study them, they're almost all straight. And we interpret that to mean that their brains saw enough testosterone early in gestation when sexual orientation got fixed. But we also found that they were more likely to report being gender nonconforming than control men. So they're straight, but growing up as boys, they were less likely to be gender conforming. And we interpret that to mean that was a result of not seeing testosterone in late gestation and right after birth. If we look at women with this IGD, they have the same HCG before birth, but the ovaries aren't producing very much until until control girls make their own GnRH, and then they have very complicated estrogenic release after that. Whereas girls with IGD see only the early estrogen, but don't see later estrogen. They also don't see much in the way of androgen. In any case, no more than other women. And what we found was that those women with IGD, they're all straight, they grow up and they're attracted to men. But we can ask people, the questionnaires, how excited are you by men really, sexually, right? And there's scales that measure that. And not all straight women are the same. And it turned out that our individuals who had IGD, who didn't see that late prenatal estrogen surge, didn't see the postnatal estrogen surge, they're straight, yeah, but they're really not that androphilic. They're not that into men. And so we interpret that to mean that the late androgens and estrogens are affecting that. That maybe the absence of androgen early in gestation means you'll be attracted to men, but that estrogen later in gestation and right after birth, that somehow increases sexual interest in men. And finally, there's a disorder called cloacal exstrophy, where in babies before birth, the abdominal wall doesn't quite close up and in time for them to be born. So they're born and the intestines are exposed. And typically in these cases, the genitalia haven't quite formed. This is a medical emergency, right? This infant, this newborn needs surgery right away to seal up the abdominal wall. And it can happen in either males or females. But what's going to happen next is the surgeon is going to have to decide what kind of genitalia to build. And it's a lot easier to build female-looking genitalia than it is male-looking genitalia when there's no phallic material at all. So almost always in these cases, in consultation with the parents, the decision is made to raise these XY individuals as girls. So remove the testes so there won't be any testosterone around. Do your best to seal up the abdominal wall and try to form what looks like typical clitoris and labia and stuff like that, and then raise them as girls. And what's interesting about these cases, that's XY, is that 8 of the 14 at puberty declared, or sometime before puberty, declared to the parents that they were actually boys. And there you have to wonder, well, maybe their parents were uncertain about their gender or something like that. But what I also think is interesting is that 6 of them seem to be perfectly happy in the role of a female, but all of them are attracted to girls. Even those who are comfortable with a gender identity as female, even they are attracted to females. And so we interpret this to mean that and remember, these individuals were exposed to normal male levels of androgen. So we take this to mean that these are other cases where if your brain's exposed to androgen early in gestation, you're going to grow up to be gynophilic. It's different in different cases. It isn't quite so clear. In most of the cases, it sounds like these people, these ones who declared they were boys, that their parents had never told them that. So it does seem to be spontaneous. I'm trying to decide what to get to next. Yeah, we'll do this. Questions about that so far? So I think that if you look at these various measures, the sort of hidden measures of prenatal testosterone and these clinical cases of IGD, et cetera, I think there's pretty good evidence that androgens before birth have an influence on whether you're going to be gay or straight when you grow up. Having said that, oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Yeah. That's another great question. No, as far as I understand from the report, they were all they were all interested in sex. They all had romantic crushes, but they were all on girls. And yeah, other questions. I'm going to talk about, lastly, a famous case. It's what's talked about in the Nova documentary that I want you to watch, about, it goes by several different names, but I want to offer some of my take on this that isn't in the Nova. So in Canada, a pair of monozygotic twins are born, males, and for complicated reasons, when the twins are 7 months of age, their parents decide that they should be circumcised. And at that point, the procedure at the local hospital was to leave the boys there overnight. They'd be circumcised, and they'd come back to the hospital, pick them up in the morning. Unfortunately, the physician who was supposed to do the circumcision was incompetent. And so he decided to try to using a cautery to take off the foreskin, and he didn't set it properly. And so one of the babies, the penis was burned off. Yep, I got their attention. And when the parents came in the morning, no, they didn't call them right away. They said, "Oh, there's been an accident, and the baby's stable now." And so for a while, the real names were Bruce and Brian, and it was Bruce whose penis was burned off at 7 months of age. And eventually, the parents, who were working class, not educated, eventually they saw a guy on TV who seemed really smart and talked about how socialization was everything there is about, bless you, about sex and gender. A guy named John Money, who was at Johns Hopkins, one of the most prestigious universities in the nation, very charismatic, very articulate, was on TV a lot. And so they contact him and tell him about this case. And he assures them, just raise Bruce as a girl. She'll never know the difference, and she'll be perfectly happy as a girl. And so they did everything in their power. They changed Bruce's name to Brenda and raised him as a girl. And Money then spent the next 10 years telling the world that this Brenda was very happy as a girl, a very well-adjusted girl. And this proves that socialization is the key to being happy in your gender, and proves how important socialization is. In fact, though, he was lying. Oh, and by the first psychology course I take, introductory psychology, taught by a developmental psychologist, he presented this case and assured me and everybody else in the class that socialization is the only thing that matters for gender identity, because look at that. Here was an individual whose brain was exposed to testosterone before birth, who had a penis the first 7 months of life. And yet, if you raise them as a girl, they'll be happy as a girl. It's a great question. I can tell you it had already entered the literature as established fact when I took introductory psychology in 1973. So it was sometime before that, late 60s, that this happened. And yeah. But the truth is that John Money kind of creeped the kids out, and at some point, they refused to go because he kept asking questions about sex and what they wanted to do with sex and what sort of sex play they did, et cetera. And so they stopped going to him. And he continued to tell the world that this girl was perfectly happy as a girl. But in fact, she was very unhappy. And eventually, confronted her father, who eventually told her the truth. And she said she was relieved because she always felt like she was really a boy. Now, there's a book about this. It's a great book. You should try it. Here's a picture of David. He changed his name to David when he transitioned back to being a man. And you'll hear what happened there. Actually, I don't remember if it's that, but eventually, he was attracted to women, had always been attracted to women. When he was a little girl, he fantasized about having a sports car and a girlfriend and a mustache. That's what Brenda wanted. But she couldn't tell anybody that. And once he transitioned, he eventually met a woman, fell in love with a woman, married her. She had children. He was delighted to be a father to these kids. And it might sound like a happy ending up to that point. Except eventually a journalist, John Colapinto. Oh, and to make it personal again, I first learned the truth about this because Nick, the kid I told you about, he had a subscription to Rolling Stone magazine. And it comes to my house one day, and I'm seeing on the cover that there's something about the John who became Joe case. What? In Rolling Stone magazine? So John Colapinto had written this exposure that basically money was not telling the truth about what was going on. And in that article, he uses only pseudonyms, and he doesn't do anything to identify where these people are. But it's such a big hit. Colapinto wants to write a book about it, and he knows that if he has the book, if it's going to be a big bestseller, that he needs to have David come on TV to help promote the book. So he persuades David to let him use his real name, persuades the whole family for him to use their real name. And they go on national TV, and the book is indeed a hot sell, still sells today, still in print, etc. They're on Oprah, things like that. But of course, eventually the book tour is over, and when David goes back home, everybody in their town, relatively small town, knows about this truth, including his stepkids. And he eventually loses. His wife leaves him. And Colapinto shares some of the royalties of the book with him. But David, trusts a friend to invest the money for him. And guess what? It disappears. So he's utterly destitute, divorced, and the whole world knows the sordid details of what happens to him. And so he kills himself. Oh, and somewhere in there, his twin brother, who had a drug problem, is, in and out of rehab, etc. David goes to a parking lot, parks his car, takes a gun, and kills himself. By the way, in a very masculine mode of suicide, right? It's men who shoot themselves, not poison themselves. Now, there are lots of lessons you can take from this, and the Nova video will pursue some, but there's an aspect of it, and hopefully you won't find me tedious that I do this so often. To my mind, there is such a class component to this horrible story. At 3 different stages in the life of this family, it was people with professional degrees, people who were regarded as very smart, who totally failed this family. First of all, it was the physician who was too bashful, too afraid to admit he didn't know how to do the circumcision. And the hospital makes a settlement with him, and I don't remember the details of the monetary settlement, but believe me, it wasn't enough. And they persuaded him, well, this is the best we can do, right? So there's number 2. Number 3, they go to one of the most famous psychologists in the world, and he assures them everything will be fine. Just raise this baby as a girl, and she'll be fine. And then number 4, a journalist, right? Or someone with a degree, a professional person, goes to his family and says, the best thing to happen here is to tell the world who you really are, and you'll make some money at it. And this is the best thing for you. So in all 4 of those cases, this middle-class family had so-called experts telling them what to do with their lives. And in each case, it was disastrously bad advice. And that the Nova special isn't going to tell you, Maya. Well, I mean, of course, it's somewhat personal. I certainly don't pretend to know all the reasons, but probably the spotlight didn't help. And it may be that having lost all his money didn't help, right? Because here's someone from a working class family, said, he's got a lot of money. For the first time, working class people don't have money to invest, right? You're just trying to make sure you pay the rent next week. And again, it was someone who supposedly knew better that would invest his money for him and lost it all. So, yeah, that's my soapbox, that aspect. Other questions about this case? Sorry that we won't get to a cahoot about it, but I think I will encourage you to please be sure to finish reading chapter 11 to be ready for the midterm. And so take the midterm this weekend. And after that, I hope you have a great break. Okay.